So nice to see all of you here. So my topic today is the change of civilizations that is happening in the world. And so this, my usual thing is something about Dalai Lama and Buddhism, but this is also really very good to talk about with you, because you are you're a professional, you're going to be students of foreign relations, and I think the foreign relations of Russia couldn't be more important in this context. So I'm really delighted to have the chance to talk with you. I apologize for taking my jacket off, but I was a little bit hot. So I'm just here informally talking with you. And why do I say that? The Dalai Lama said bravely in 1988, first time I heard him say it, he said that 21st century, there cannot be any war. He said the 20th century was a century of terrible war and very, very destructive, a lot of people killed and so forth. And 21st century has to be a different kind of century where conflict are resolved by dialogue and not by violence. And when he said that, people were a bit surprised, because we all are taught that war is sort of inevitable and you have to have it and everybody gets into it and human being is like that. And that's what we've been taught. And as you know, of course, America and Russia engaged in what was called the Cold War since the end of the World War II. America and Russia were two winners of the World War II. America, Russia, France, Germany, and China were considered the five winners, and therefore they're the five ones with the veto power in the Security Council of the United Nations. And yet, instead of saying the end of, United Nations founded with many effort in the Charter of United Nations to prevent war in the future, nevertheless, two of the founders then got into this idea of the Cold War. And then there was mutual assured destruction. I don't know if it's the same acronym in Russian, probably not, but in English, mutual assured destruction means MAD, which means insane, actually. MAD means angry or insane, MAD. But that's how the world then was until the late 80s. And then, in the late 80s, the Cold War was declared over. And then since then, I think the ruling elite were not listening to the Dalai Lama, even though he is a kind of world leader of world leaders. He knows all of the leaders of the world pretty much, most of them. Most of them have met the Dalai Lama at some time or another, and he knew most of them, but they didn't listen to him. And so I would say since 1990 until now, the ruling elite of the different countries in the world, more or less, with some exceptions, were looking for a new war, because they're used to a war economy, a war industry, a huge amount of money. Last year, I think 2 years ago, the Swedish institute that tracks that subject, they publish, SIPRI is this acronym, I forget exactly, the Swedish Institute of something, but it studies the arms business. And in the 2010, I think, something like nearly $2 trillion of new weapons were sold in the world. Mostly, some by the big countries, bought by the big countries, but a lot of them bought by little countries where, like in Africa and in South America and Latin America and other places where they really still have a lot of problem feeding all their citizens, and yet they're still buying a lot of weapons. Or even China, which is doing a big military build-up, has a lot of still very poor people, even maybe up to 900, 800 million, in spite of some people have been lifted up by their industrialization. Still, there's an enormous number of very poor people in China. And now America has a lot of poor people too. And yet they spend so much money on the military. And yet nobody has any enemy, really. Where's the enemy? Who is really an enemy? What state is an enemy of what state? Since the Cold War, there isn't any enemy, really. Although, as I said, the ruling elite has been desperate to find an enemy. They need one, because you can't convince the population to spend all the money in military or a huge portion of it unless they feel there's some really terrible enemy out there. And you frighten them with the idea of that enemy. So, unfortunately, the leaders of the planet, countries today, are still really in a previous century where war meant something. And so when we talk of change of civilization, now, first of all, what do we mean by civilization? Civilization does not mean having a subway having an automobile, having a heating system. Those are material amenities that can or be useful or not useful, depending on the circumstances. But actually, they don't constitute civilization. I think we mean by civilization for 2,500 years, we have been meaning by civilization. We have been meaning gentleness. A civilized person is gentle, actually, right? Not violent, right? In a city, for example, civilization comes from kiwis, the Greek word for city, and civilization enabling people to live in cities. And if you live in city, if you have a really violent person, pretty soon they get arrested or they get killed or they kill somebody, and you can't really have a viable city if there are too many violent people. So people have to be gentle. Then again, people who live in cities mix with a lot of other people. Cities are pluralistic, so you meet people who don't agree with you, who don't look like you, who have a different mythology, different worldview, different religion, and you can't be thinking that somebody who doesn't have my worldview, my language, even different language, you can't be thinking that such a person is an alien and they are not human and I can't deal with them and therefore they somehow cannot be considered. So you need wisdom that knows how to think. You need reasoning. You can't just enforce some authority on people in cities so easily. It's difficult. So cities tend to make people democratic. So we have wisdom, we have gentleness, we have tolerance and pluralism. These are the things you tolerate people, even you don't agree with them. You tolerate them, you're not harsh with them. Because being in a city, it does not do that. You lose your old worldview that you're in a small village or a small tribe. You had a shaman who told you the story of the universe, and that was all that you believed. But then in the city, you meet people with different stories, so you begin to analyze these different stories, and you develop reason, critical reason. And in the West, people teach that this kind of began in the Mediterranean, in Greece, and Rome, and Palestine, and Egypt, this kind of thinking about 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. And we still, when you get educated, you still read Socrates, you still read Plato, you still read Aristotle. Those people are still influential in our culture. Of course, Jesus is there, and the Hebrews who collected the Bible only in the 5th century in Babylon. They collected the Jewish Bible. So these are still, and in India, it's Buddha, who lived around the same time, 500 years before Jesus, but at the same time they collected the Jewish Bible. And Confucius in China, Lao Tzu, these are all what's called axial age figure. Iran was Zoroaster. And they're all approximately middle of first millennium before the Common Era. And all of them basically agree that being civilized means being gentle, wise, tolerant, pluralistic, and rational. And not just rigid and violent, right? So therefore, modernity, industrialization, having powerful machines, you can be just as savage as some guy in the jungle with a spear, But it's even worse, actually, because you have more powerful weapons. So we can't say that the World War II was not a time of civilization. It was not even a clash of civilization. It was a time of savagery, but industrial savagery, not primitive savagery, but industrial savagery. So that's the first thing. We have to say that civilizations are ways in which human beings have learned to live together in a peaceful manner. Because most of the time people have to be peaceful, and also you can't just have peace because you have strong police force. You have peace because people internalize a certain way of behavior, a way of thinking, where they treat each other decently, basically. They're always aberrational people, and they have to be punished or captured or protected against. But majority, for example, in Moscow, I don't know the murder rate in Moscow. I know in New York, a person is killed, usually a couple people a week, maybe once a day, sometimes a few more people get killed. And then in the news, there is a so-and-so was killed last night at a bar or something. But they don't report 12 million people didn't kill each other today. About 1 million felt like it. They would have liked to kill somebody, but 10 or 12 million didn't do it. So they never mentioned that. So we're very worried about the exceptional cases of violence in our cities, and the news focuses on them, And then we pay a lot of money for police force and things like that. But the point is the majority of the people have internalized a certain human behavior which is peaceful, and that's what civilization is. Okay? Now, in America, there is an influential historian called Samuel Huntington. He was at Harvard, and he was part of the movement which we call neoconservative in America, and which were the people underlying or behind the disastrous invasion of Iraq, which was basically a crime against humanity, although it has never been admitted still, but it basically was a crime. The reason that it was a crime, a war crime, is that Iraq actually did not attack the United States. They were not involved in 9/11. They did not attack the United States. And therefore, there really was, to attack a country, the doctrine that Richard Cheney elaborated originally actually in 1992, but he really brought it out in force after 9/11 in 2001. But when he worked under the first Bush, and he brought that doctrine out, and it's called the doctrine of preemptive war, meaning you can attack somebody if you think they might attack you. And that is a criminal doctrine, actually. That is, the Germans who were hung at Nuremberg were hung for pursuing aggressive war, was the title of the crime. And they were hung for that, for invading Czechoslovakia, I believe, was the particular, there are many other crimes, but that's the one that they hung them for. So attacking someone who has not attacked you is an international war crime. If there was international law, it would be considered a war crime. And that was stirred up by the theory of clash of civilization and the theory of preemptive war, which is a wrong theory, and we don't like it, actually. But the government elite, as I say, this is when you're desperate. When you're a government elite who's used to sitting on top of a war culture, war industry, war government, war machine, Pentagon in the case of the United States, then you don't have an enemy, you're desperate because your income, your job, you're losing your job. So you have to find an enemy. So, of course, if you can attack anybody you think will be an enemy, who hasn't yet done anything to you, then you have an endless supply of enemies. And then you can keep your power as a war leader by having war, all right? So that's against what the change of civilization that we need, and actually we will inevitably have. I take some comfort as someone who is very upset about this Iraq war, like majority of my countrymen in the United States did not approve of Iraq war. Do not believe the media that you read. Yeah, let's go get them, and the people who watch Fox News are a small percentage, 20%, 30%. Majority were totally against Iraq war, are totally against it now, against the Afghanistan war. Maybe a punitive expedition into Afghanistan because of Al-Qaeda would have been approved by a larger majority. Even a Buddhist like myself, I couldn't really say no about that. Just for a few weeks that they got rid of Al-Qaeda, because a lot of Afghani people didn't like Al-Qaeda and didn't like Taliban. So they got rid of that very quickly. But then they invaded the country and tried to occupy, and then that has been losing ever since for 10 years. And it's impossible, and that will be a loss, just as it was for Russia before. Because the modern economy, the modern system, in a way, the war industry has priced itself out of business by inventing weapons that are so powerful that they cannot be used, actually. And therefore, no one can win a war. There's a wonderful book in English by Jonathan Schell, which I recommend to you all, Schell, called The Unconquerable World, written in the 90s, I think, maybe in the 2000s. I forgot the date of publication, and it's not influenced by Gandhi or Dalai Lama or anything Eastern. It's influenced by his analysis of the modern economy and the modern situation, and he begins his analysis analyzing the theories of the Prussian theorist of war, von Clausewitz, who you must have heard of, who wrote the famous book on war that has been the Bible of the war people. He was a Prussian, for 100 years or more. And in which theory he says that the purpose of war is to defeat an enemy army of a neighboring country or an enemy country, and then when you defeat that army, they surrender, and then you can make the country do something that you wanted them to do that you couldn't negotiate diplomatically. Right? That's the function of war, according to von Clausewitz. And Schell's argument is, which I think you can understand easily without reading the whole book, but our book is worth reading. Schell's argument is that no longer is operative because the nature of the weapons of war now are such that you don't really just fight the enemy army. In fact, the enemy army is not even that important because the war is over very quickly, really, and you destroy the enemy country is what it is. So therefore, the 95%, in Clausewitz's time, 95% of casualty were soldiers. But today, 95% of casualty are civilians, what they call euphemistically collateral damage, unintended damage, which in a way is like terrorism. It's like you're destroying innocent people because you're after your enemy, like Saddam Hussein. In Baghdad, for example, they bombed all over the city. They bombed all civilians, and they killed over 4 million people. 1.5 million people, and they displaced 4 million people who became homeless in Iraq, and 3 or 4 million left the country. So they basically destroyed the country. And that's why they'll never make peace with that country, and the people in that country will never do whatever Dick Cheney wanted them to do, and Mr. Bush wanted them to do. They will never do that because they are furiously upset and angry because their families were killed, their houses were destroyed, their neighborhoods, their entire country was destroyed. And it's not over. When they leave, when the Americans leave, they will have civil war between Sunni and Shiite and Kurd, 3 big factions, since in a way Iraq was never really a real ordinary country anyway. It was a British fabrication after colonialism. So Shell's theory is, therefore, war no longer has a purpose because it's a total thing engaging an entire society, and then there cannot be the conclusion of where that people in that society will do what you want. So therefore, it no longer has a purpose, actually, and there can no longer be a winner. And then the other, all-out escalating war, like we were mutual assured destruction of nuclear weapons by everybody, that also has no purpose because anybody who uses them, the radioactive pollution will destroy the whole planet, and it'll be all over, and nobody can win. The wind will blow it, Like nowadays, the Chinese coal-fired power plants, the wind, lucky for Russia, the wind usually blows east. And so it blows across the Pacific, and they get terrible pollution in California and Oregon and British Columbia from that terrible polluting industrialization in China, as well as in China. Well, you're lucky here in Russia; it doesn't come here; it has to go all the way around the planet first. So these are not idealistic ideas that I'm telling you. These are actual, factual practicalities, and they make war impossible. Actually, you can have a small little thing and act like Reagan. He invaded the island of Grenada, a tiny little island in the Caribbean with a few people there, a few Marxists there, He invaded, the hero of Grenada, ridiculous, not anything. Then Bush invaded Panama, so silly, not really war. You can't have war, is the point. So how does civilization change when you can't have war? Well, you have a very different idea of civilization. And you have actually even the hope of civilization, because then suddenly the martial virtues, particularly in men, are no longer so great. Rambo, you can make as many Rambo movies as you want, but still, Rambo is not really useful. Remember poor Rambo, when he went home, he didn't have a wife. He couldn't have had a wife. He would have had post-traumatic stress syndrome and probably murdered his family. When his children screamed at night or something, because he was a wreck. Because violence makes you into kind of a nervous wreck. And we have people coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan and America today have a most terrible suicide rate. They have a terrible family situation, and they have to go to psychiatrists, and it costs a fortune. And I mean, it's hopeless. It's just terrible. So, in fact, the education of young people, especially men, that you're supposed to be a bit violent, and you're supposed to be tough, and you're supposed to be unfeeling, and you're not supposed to listen to women. And women, of course, they put some women in the army, like they're just token thing, but nowadays in some modern armies, and women can be tough too, but basically women are more intelligent and more conciliatory and more capable of dealing with conflict by talking and by dialoguing and by looking for connections and trying to make it better. Their nature is more like that because they are the mothers, And they are pushed around by the men, actually, in an uncivilized manner in all of the so-called developed countries. And in the underdeveloped ones, the ones that are really badly underdeveloped, some of the Muslim countries, some of the Latin American countries, where women are pretty much enslaved by the men, and then they have too many children. They're forced to have many more children than they want, and then they have a terrible population problem in those cultures. And then the men are also very unhappy, and they tend to be violent, and then they tend to, like the Middle East, famous war area of the Middle East, supposedly insoluble problem in the Middle East, which is of course not at all insoluble. It's very easily soluble. It's really not a problem, actually. If people didn't have a livelihood, the leadership had power and livelihood by making it a problem and refusing to have a discussion, then it's a problem when you're in the hands of such a leaders. Now, we just saw in the Arab Spring, we saw the fall of Mubarak. We saw the fall of a number of dictators. We are probably seeing the fall of Assad in Syria. We would have seen by now, I think, the fall of Ahmadinejad and the Ayatollahs in Iran if it hadn't been for the Iraq invasion. That gave them extra strength because of the presence of an external enemy nearby, the Americans invading Iraq. It gave them power, the Basij and the sort of rigorous thing. Otherwise, young people in Iran were totally fed up with the Ayatollah's regime, And the Arab Spring, you have Facebook. Recently, I was at a conference in Berlin, and I heard some oil executives, big oil companies, and they were talking about the transparency of the planetary society. We have 1 billion people on Facebook, nearly now, almost 1 billion, will soon be 1 billion. And if you added in people on Baidu, even in China, even though that's supposedly controlled, you have like maybe 2 billion people who are electronically connected. I'm sure you all have your phones and Facebooks. You probably have to turn them off in class, so you're not texting your friends. But I bet you all have them, right? You all have your smartphones, right? Don't you? Anybody doesn't have a you don't have a smartphone? Oh, you poor thing. You don't know what's going on, Well, that's all right. You have more peace of mind, actually, than those of us with iPhones and things. But on the other hand, like someone like me, an old fossil like me, if I want to talk to my daughter, and nowadays especially to my grandchildren, I better be able to text and receive a text, because that's how they communicate. So then Grandpa, if he doesn't know how to text, then you rarely see them. You don't know what's going on. So even an old person has to get one to keep track of the grandchildren. Nowadays, and I think Russia will be like that too. So this oil people were saying transparency, and they say if you want to have a good brand management, what they call in business, a good reputation, you cannot have an area where you're trying to hide some bad things, because someone will come and take a picture with an iPhone, and it'll go on Facebook, and 1 billion people will know that you're behaving badly. So you have to actually walk your talk, as we say in the United States. You have to do what you say you're going to do. And this is really, really very important thing. Now, okay, I promised I would also say something about Huntington. I lost the track of that. Now, Huntington wrote a book in which he talked about the clash of civilizations. But as I say, the real motive in this book, since he was a neoconservative thinker, like someone like Kissinger, Wolfowitz, these are all neoconservatives. He said the two civilizations, thinking not in terms of what I have defined civilization as, but just in terms of some organized society, he said the two that we have a kind of clash are China and Islamic civilization. The Western, he didn't say Christian, but Western sort of whatever it is, rationalist, whatever they think Western society is clashing with Islamic and with Chinese society or civilization. And these clashes are hopeless, he would say, and there is really no meeting ground for them, and they are very dangerous, and they represent the great dangers of the 21st century. And his book became very popular because it was very useful in America and Europe to this leadership that I'm telling you about, that is a leadership that depends on a militaristic lifestyle, a militaristic economy, a militaristic army, a militaristic industry, and a militaristic police force within a country. Because once you have a big army, you have to treat your own citizens like potential, evildoers, and you have to have a kind of militarized police force. In the United States today, when we had the Occupy movement, which still is there, although it's been a little bit battered, but one of the reasons it was battered is that since 9/11, in the last 11 years, especially during the Bush administration, but continuing, unfortunately, in the Obama administration, the police forces in the United States have become militarized. They have like high-tech rifles. They have armor. They SWAT teams. You know, they're kind of overreact to everything, and they shoot they're trained to like sort of be ready to shoot everybody all the time because they're, you know, it's part of the war on terror. Any local citizen might be a terrorist, and we have a lot of Muslim citizens in the United States, and all of them might be terrorists, you know. And the Chinese are not approached. Chinese Americans are not approached as terrorists, in spite of the clash of civilizations with China, supposedly, the fake clash of civilization with China. Because our business elite and our people in our government are making money from China, and so they don't want to make Chinese into dangerous people yet. Not yet. They're waiting. After we finish with the Muslims, then they'll bring on the Chinese as an enemy. Is of course they almost did with that plane that crashed in you know, that was brought down, the American surveillance plane. Remember in Hainan Island? You're too young. But there was an incident like that before they had 9/11, where they were almost getting after, Cheney was almost on the case with China. But they really wouldn't do that because the business relationship in China is too strong. But otherwise, China is the next big enemy for everybody to keep the war business going, understand? That's really the purpose of it. It isn't that they are an enemy. There is no class of civilization. It is completely fake. Chinese people are not different human beings than every other human being. They're very, very similar. Actually, the genetic difference between a so-called Caucasian person and a Chinese person is less great than two different villages in the Congo, the genetic differences. Because, you know, we all came from being black people. First monkeys before that, our genes, and then black people, all of us. There's no white people. Then like we got bleached out in the north, you know, not much sun, you know, and we lost our suntan over 1 million years, you know, whatever, 100,000 years. But otherwise, genetically, there's no difference. And spiritually, from the point of view of karma or Buddhist theory, Buddhist biology, there's really no difference. Chinese people don't like to be slaves. They don't like to just follow orders. They like to party. They like to have a good time. They can be nice and they can be bad, like all of us. Really very, very similar. And Confucius taught ethics that were internalized in a person. He was a great teacher, like Buddha, like Jesus. Confucius was. He was pragmatic, actually. He didn't go into a heavy deal about God going to fix everything. Human beings have to behave in a certain way. And he was very, very strict about it. But, of course, he did have a problem. He didn't really listen to his wife. But nobody did in those days because of the male chauvinist way of all of our societies, pretty much. And until now, because of the war thing. Because we've been dominated by the war things, which has always made democracy difficult, which has always made happiness difficult. Because without the positive input of women, there's no happiness. Because everyone depends on mom initially. We're all helpless. Rambo was a helpless infant for 10 years, depending on the kindness of his mom. And then later he got to be Rambo, ready to kill everybody. He was trained like that. Because human being is very flexible. A nice human being can become a vicious killer. A vicious killer can become a nice human being. Human beings are completely flexible. And that's why education is so important. What you are doing is so important that you are studying and you're educated. One thing I like to tell people in my classrooms in Columbia, I tell them to stay in school as long as possible. And I particularly like it when their parents come on a certain day, Parents' Day. I say, stay in school as long as your parents will pay. Because education is very expensive in the West. I don't know here if you still have some support, state support for education. I hope so. Actually, education should be free. Lifelong education should be free in every country and could easily be done if we didn't have big military budgets in every country. Education could easily be free, lifelong for people. And if the more people know, the human being, fundamentally, from the point of view of Buddhist science, which is basically science about the mind, the human beings, the greatest thing that human beings do is learn. That's what your brain is about. Your brain is capable of learning endlessly. And actually, your brain keeps growing even in old age. Did you ever hear of the neuroplasticity? Do you know what that is? Neuroplasticity? It's a recent concept by neuroscience. Until about 10 years ago, it was a dogma that the brain is the only part of the body which never produces new cells. You know, other parts of the body produce new cells, regenerate to some extent, you know, like stem cells sort of idea. But the brain doesn't, was the dogma until 10 years ago. Then one woman scientist in New York, Rockefeller University, she did experiments with monkeys and things, and she proved, which took her a lot of people were like, oh, she's all crazy, she doesn't know what she's talking about. You know, the people at Harvard and Yale attacked her for a long time. And finally, she proved with the data, what they couldn't reject, that the brain also produces new cells every day. Your brain grows every day. However, this is what I like. If you don't learn something that day, new, those new cells don't attach to your neural net. They kind of dribble away. You have like a drink or something, they're gone. So therefore you're capable of learning and increasing your intelligence all your whole life, not just while you're young. And so education is not just so you can go and get a job and a salary and go on the cycle that Rinpoche talked about. Education is actually the purpose of your life, because the more you understand about yourself and the more you understand about life, the happier you will be. Ignorance is not bliss. Ignorance is suffering, is the cause of suffering. Actually, Buddha, let me take a little sidetrack now. So therefore, Muslims are not an inevitable enemy. The Islamic civilization, though, the Islamic culture everywhere, has one particular problem, which is that the theologians who interpret the Quran and the Hadith, if you know what these are the scriptures of Islamic tradition. The Quran are the speech that Muhammad channeled from the angel Gabriel, which are considered therefore divine speech. You know, like some fundamentalist Christians think every word of the Bible is God's word, you know, from God, they think. Which scholars, of course, do not think that. And more moderate Christians, non-fundamentalist Christians, do not think that. They think there's some good things and great teachings of Jesus and so forth, but there are some silly things, old-fashioned things in the Bible. You know, the critical scholar is like that in the West, you know. But in Islam, the fundamentalists have been in charge of theology for 300 years. There has been no moderate theological seminary in Islam for 300 years. You have to understand the impact of that on interpretation of Islam. And why, and particularly in the last century, it's particularly bad. And why is that? Because the British empowered the Saudi clan, the Saud clan, to be in charge of all of Saudi Arabia because they had an oil relationship with the Saudi princes. And the Saudis, therefore, have a lot of money, as you know, right? The Saudi sheikhs. And in the 17th century, the Saudi family adopted a man called Ibn al-Wahhab, his name, who founded what is called the Wahhabi strand of Islam. And the Wahhabi strand was extremely conservative and fundamentalist and very violent. And it completely suppressed women. Muhammad did not suppress women, actually. Muhammad was very fair, and he moderated the laws of the Arabia in his time to benefit women. He was extremely, he liked women, actually, in fact. It may have been a problem for his community a little bit, but he had quite a few wives. Although partly because his followers, many were killed in the wars, that they were persecuted, and so he adopted them to protect them. I don't think he was attached to all of them, I hope. But in any case, he was not oppressive of women. He did not involve, was nothing in the Quran about female genital mutilation, for example, which is an African thing, tribal thing. There was nothing in the Quran about wearing the chador and hiding yourself like this. There was nothing like that. And Arabian women in his time did not do that and were not forced to do that. There's nothing in the Quran that women cannot drive cars like in Saudi Arabia, etc., if you know something about Saudi Arabia. And then because they had so much money, it was the revival of Islam everywhere, in Pakistan, in the former Soviet republics that have high Muslim populations. Wherever it is, if you want to build a mosque, you get money from Saudi Arabia. And they give you money for a mosque only if you take a Saudi preacher or a Saudi trained preacher, minister. And the Saudi monk or minister or preacher, they don't have monks actually, minister or preacher, mullah, is trained in the Wahhabi form of Islam. So this very conservative Islam is being spread, like fundamentalist Islam. And this is why in Europe, the Muslims do not mix with the Europeans and do not integrate well in the European societies, a great number of them, causing big reaction against them in Europe. This is why they are a problem in America even to some extent, and I believe in Russia you have had some problems, and you will continue to have. Islam is one of the recognized religions of the Russian Federation, but the Muslim population, what we don't understand is the Muslim population is exposed to a very fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, and therefore they are more rigid about their cultural elements than they need to be from the point of view of Islam. If you had a more modernized, more liberal interpretation of Islamic scripture, they are no worse than a Christian, no more violent than a Jew, no more violent than a Buddhist or a Hindu. They are perfectly able to mix in a pluralistic society like the other religions in the world. And although the Dalai Lama does say, but not to his fellow Buddhists and to Christians and to Muslims, he does argue that in the 21st century, that it is past time for religions to try to convert each other, to be missionary, to say you shouldn't be Christian, you should be Buddhist, or you shouldn't be Buddhist, you should be Christian. You shouldn't be Muslim, you should be Christian. You shouldn't be Christian, you should be Muslim. This kind of approach that still exists in many religious traditions is anachronistic, and it is dangerous, and it causes conflict, and it's unacceptable, basically, in a pluralistic society. And therefore, the Dalai Lama has always argued that the different religious leaders should not try to sort of go out and brainwash people to join their religion who are not already members. And he also always says when he gives lectures, don't come to me and say you want to be a Buddhist if you like something I'm talking about compassion or happiness or the meditation or the mind or whatever it might be, any kind of philosophy. If you learn something useful for your mind and in your education, then use that as a Christian, even as a secular humanist, if you're not a religious person. He's all fine with that. He considers that a world religion, actually, secular humanism. Secularism is kind of a world religion. He usually says something like 1 or 2 billion people in the world are non-religious, what he calls non-believers. And that's also fine, as long as they have an ethic, as long as they have a kind of spirituality of kindness and compassion, try to better life. He's cool with that. I'm a little less cool with that, actually. I'm a little more critical of secularism in some respects. But he and I have an argument about that. But he's totally into that, and in world religious meetings, comparative religious meetings, he always wants to have representative of secular humanism and scientists, scientific materialists, because he thinks they are a world movement, and they have an ideology, and they have their own fundamentalists, and they have their own more liberal, open-minded ones, and they are part of the dialogue. And therefore, when you have Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Confucian, Taoist, Muslim, Baha'i, Sikh, you should have also secular humanists on the table, and they're having a discussion about no God, no soul, etc., just the brain, whatever. That's their view, and they should be able to express that, and also hear criticism of it, but back and forth. He's like that. But that's hard for some groups like the Mormons in America, the Baptists. They're desperate to convert everybody to their religious view, even if you die. The Jewish people are very mad right now in America. You didn't hear because the Mormons, they have a ceremony where after you die, if you're not a Christian, they baptize you post-mortem. I don't know why they mind. Why should it bother a dead person to be baptized? Do you know what I mean? We could make them all Buddhists, Hindus, whatever. They don't care. They're already gone, They're, from a Buddhist point of view, they are looking for another life, and they might not be Christian. They might be born whatever, or if you're a materialist, you think they just don't exist. So what do they care, But they're all upset with the Mormons in America for this post-mortem baptism, and the Mormons have promised to stop doing it. I think it's actually funny. It's really funny. Anybody can baptize me anytime. I don't mind. That's fine.
Mr. Romney is running for the president.
What?
So that's why Mr. Romney is running for the president.
Yes, yeah. Well, that's why he probably stopped, After he's president, he'll baptize us all, if he were to be president, which we hope he will not, actually, because he's totally in the grip of the warmongers. Wants to bomb Iran and all this. He totally says he's going to bomb Iran, really bad. That would be really terrible, extremely bad. Anyway. So the point is that, however, there needs to be, for example, here you deal with foreign relations. I have been trying at Columbia University for some time, and I got the president of the university to agree with me, and we did raise some funds, and we started in that direction. But it's hard to convince political science people and others of a priority. But because traditional classical political science is against religion in general, because they think religion makes people unreasonable and it can't be involved with it. I once told Richard Holbrooke, the late Richard Holbrooke, I once told him that the Greek High Patriarch, His All Holiness Bartholomew, who I happen to personally know, who's a wonderful man, by the way. I don't know if he's ever visited Russia, and people know him, Orthodox people know him, but he's a marvelous person, lives in Istanbul. And he told me that if the Turkish government would allow the Greeks to have religious ceremonies in Hagia Sophia church in Istanbul, if they would allow that, which is only kind of a museum, but it's not a very nice museum, nobody really goes there much. But if they would allow that, that he would pressure the Greek government not to put missiles in Cyprus and to negotiate this and that, and he would really work on making harmony between Greece and Turkey, and not oppose Turkey in the European Union and this kind of thing. And he told me, the patriarch told me that. So I told Richard Holbrooke this, and I said, Dick, why don't you talk to the Turkish generals at that time, to the Turkish government about that? And he said, oh no, Bob, we can't involve religion. Religion cannot be involved in diplomacy. It's too dangerous and all this. And of course he didn't do it, and then they still have conflict. Because in the 21st century, I think the world religions are important in diplomacy because they affect the governments and the populations of people. And therefore, you people who are studying foreign relations and who are going to be professional in that area, you should have a lot of study of world religions. You should understand that they are not one thing, none of them. There's different kinds of Buddhism, different kinds of Islam, different kinds of Christianity, different kinds of Hinduism, and there are more difficult ones, more rigid and intolerant types, and there are more tolerant types. And therefore, there should be an effort on the part of educational institutions and governments to sponsor the more liberal types and to try to expose the members of the more conservative ones into alternative interpretations. And especially the power of the Saudis with their Wahhabi fundamentalism should be countered in places where there are Muslim revivals. That's really important to the interaction with the Muslim population to avoid the clash of civilizations. Very, very important to do. If I've made myself clear what I'm talking about. Then in the case of Chinese are totally capable of getting along with any Western people. The Chinese people, they don't really want violence themselves. They have been traumatized by 50, 60 years of class struggle, cultural revolution, and they still are traumatized by one-party system, very corrupt, single-party domination. It doesn't matter that they're communists. They could be capitalists, like in the US. But single-party domination, as the great Chinese leader Zhao Ziyang, who was busted at the time after Tiananmen Square and put under house arrest. And then he did eventually smuggle out a book, which I'm sure some of you know, Zhao Ziyang, his name. And he said that a single-party system is very dangerous in a modern economy because it lends to too high a level of corruption. Because the party people then control the banks and they control the industries, and then you have to bribe them to get anywhere, and then they take all the money, and then it doesn't work well as an economic system. You have to have a multi-party system, which there still will be corruption, but many parties are better than two parties. America is no good because two parties are too much like each other. And you multi-party, like in Europe, is much better with smaller parties. They will criticize each other's corruption, and they will keep the media more or less free to do a little bit of investigating, and then it will be harder to be that corrupt. That was his insight, which I think is a very good insight. So the problem with China is not Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization is a very civilized civilization. They were very peaceful. They went to America before Columbus, the Italian guy on the Spanish expedition. The Chinese went. There's a lot of evidence that they did. They went to the West Coast, they went to Mexico. They did not invade. They didn't go to genocide and kill all the Native Americans like Europeans did. They went to Africa. They brought back a few elephants, but they didn't try to colonize. Now they are getting the resources out of Africa because they're industrializing and imitating Western countries and in a sort of rapacious colonial manner. But they didn't do that traditionally because they traditionally were happy to stay at home. They had great cooking. I'm sure you all like Chinese food. They had great gardening. They had a great literature. Your own rector here is or professor here is a scholar of Chinese classical tradition. The problem is the modern Chinese elite doesn't know their classical tradition. They don't know. They go about thousands of years history. They don't know what it is. I quoted Confucius to upper echelon Chinese people, and Confucius said that? They don't have no idea. They even put a Confucius statue in Tiananmen Square recently, and then they had a reaction against it, and the 16-ton statue disappeared overnight. They took it away, So the problem with them is only the poor things have been traumatized, first by colonialism and imperialism, by British and everyone, robbing them and so on. Before that, actually, by the Manchus, who were not Chinese and who were very oppressive on the Han Chinese people or the Chinese people. Manchus are not Chinese. And then they were traumatized by the Western imperialists. Then they were traumatized by, serious materialism and no spirituality, let's just say. And then finally, now they're traumatized by unrestrained, violent capitalism and militarism. And so they're like all slaves of that now. And they have lost their Chinese culture, which is where they have their own ethics, where they're taught not to lie, where they're taught to be content with what they have, where they're taught to learning, high respect for learning and for education. And they had Buddhism also, which gives a tremendous outlet to finding happiness, to developing the positive qualities of your mind and person, which is what Buddhism is about, a happiness education. And so they are going to emerge, of course, as a major civilization in harmony with the world, but not until they shift their political system. As long as they keep that political system, their leadership depends on having enemies, and you can't keep shouting about enemies forever without fighting somebody eventually. And who are they going to fight? Who are they? They're going to invade India to take Arunachal Pradesh? They're going to invade Kashmir to take the Xiaxian Glacier? I don't think so. There's the outer Mongolia is first target, and then Siberia is first target. So the Russian people should be quite worried about it, but not because of Chinese civilization, because of Chinese lack of civilization in the current system. When they change, which they will, so don't worry, I don't mean to be alarmist, then there will be a peaceful transition there. And so this then brings me to the topic of my book, Zatiem Nam Dalai Lama. I think I'm sorry I don't speak Russian. I apologize. That book. And Dalai Lama actually likes the Chinese people. He was born in a place right on the border between Tibet and China, in what the Tibetans call Amdo, and what the Chinese call Qinghai, from the Manchu time. But basically it's Tibetan, because anything over 12,000 feet, 11,000 feet altitude, that's like, what is that, like 3,500 meter or something, or 4,000 meter. Anything above that altitude is Tibet. Doesn't matter what they call it, that's Tibet. And anything above that altitude, ordinary Chinese people from lower level, ordinary Russian people from low altitude, ordinary Japanese people, American people, we cannot live there healthily all year round. We get heart disease. Women cannot have children there because they miscarry, because they cannot form placenta around the embryo with the 40% of the oxygen that they have at sea level. China's own scientists say so. You cannot colonize Tibet. It will not work because of the altitude. The one thing you can't bring you can bring rice, chopsticks, military, building, concrete, whatever you want. You can bring all of that, but you can't bring the air. You cannot bring the air from down sea level to Tibet. No one can bring the air. So they can't live there. They will not successfully live there. If they could live there, Tibet would have been part of China. 1,000 years ago, there would have been 100 million Chinese people in Tibet. There are only 6 million Tibetan people in Tibet traditionally, and that's all that are going to be able to be in Tibet. In fact, very few more people. There's currently 10, 11 million Chinese on top of the 6 million at the moment, but they have to go down 4 months out of 12. They can't stay 12 months or they get sick. And their wives, if they get pregnant, immediately are sent down into lowland because they know that they cannot bring the child to term easily. I mean, occasionally, maybe exception, but mainly they cannot have a proper pregnancy at the high altitude. So, point is, Dalai Lama, however, was born on the border. He likes the Chinese. He speaks Chinese. As a child, they spoke the language, what they call Xilinghua, a kind of dialect of Chinese from the northwest of China. Xining, that Xining language, or Xilinghua, the Tibetans call it. And he wants them to be successful. He has always wanted them to be. He wants to be their friend. It is a wrong, I've noticed here in Russia that the propaganda that the Chinese leadership says that he only wants to be independent and break Tibet away from China is not correct. In fact, historically, Tibet was independent from China. Until 1950, no Chinese person lived in Tibet. How could it be part of China? Not a single Chinese person lived there. No one. They only came in 1950, 51. Sometimes some traveler would visit and leave, like a tourist comes and goes, or a trader comes and goes to make money and then leave. But living there, no one was living there. And so historically they were, of course, independent because nobody can live there. You know, no mountain climber goes and climbs a mountain, then they leave. They don't live there. So that's a fact. But the modern time, the Dalai Lama would be very happy. He said what he wants is to be an autonomous, province within China. He wants them to be like Hong Kong, one country, two systems. He wants them to have control of their own environment so that the Chinese cannot do mining, damming of rivers, cutting of forests, and desertification of the grassland by mismanaging the high altitude level where they do not know how to manage. China, you may not know this, but China is the only major civilization, used now in a more loose way of civilization, that did not have a symbiosis, interdependency, between nomad pastoral people who herded animals and, farming people who lived in river valleys. They had no nomadic pasture. They did not herd animals. They're the only ones who built a wall against the nomadic people, and they had no milk in their diet. They never drank milk in China. That's why they're so good with tofu and with soy sauce and so on, because they never drank milk until modern period in the Chinese diet. And they used a human fertilizer, human excrement as fertilizer because they didn't have herds with manure for their farming. Do you understand? So they basically don't know how to live in a steppe, in a nomadic area like Tibet or Mongolia. They do not know how. And all they do is make a mess and destroy the environment because they want to live there like a peasant farmer down in the river valley, and you can't live on those high altitude. If you plow the steppe, it blows away and becomes a desert in next year. It finishes. The grass is the only thing that works. So Tibetans are happy there with their yaks. The yaks are the only thing that make it livable for them. So point is, it's impractical, the whole attempt to wrongly control Tibet by the Chinese government. People don't want to go there. Chinese people, they go because they get paid double, triple money. And they don't have a job in their village, but they will go. But they will then leave after a few months. So Dalai Lama doesn't want independence. He wants autonomy, like Hong Kong has. He wants to be part of China because China is becoming prosperous, and he knows they're a powerful, important country. And furthermore, Chinese people have a great craving for Buddhism, which was a major element of their culture for thousands of years. And they want it, and they love it. In Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in America, where you have large Chinese communities, they go crazy for the Dalai Lama. They love him. And underground in China, as the professor said when we were talking earlier, they go to the Buddhist temples. And even Communist Party officials go to the Buddhist temples. And so it will be just no problem. All they have to do is get over the military kind of World War II. We have to crush everybody. We have to have this colony here. We have to have that one. We have to have empire kind of idea. They have to get over that. And then they will be friendly with Tibetan. There'll be a public relation bonanza for them instead of this disaster of embarrassing nonsense that they are doing, arresting their Nobel Prize laureates, treating them as enemies, and acting all frightened of everybody. The powerful government leaders, because they themselves are not really giving what the people themselves want. Freedom of internet, freedom of democracy, multi-party system, freedom of business and so forth, so they don't have to bribe corrupt communist officials. They're not giving that to their own people, so they're afraid of their own people. And when they be friendly with, and Dalai Lama is there to help them be friendly. He will be spokesperson for the Chinese. He will try to help them with relationships with other people. He will try to help them avoid conflicts with other people. And he will be a wish-fulfilling jewel for them. That is the argument. And therefore, I claim, and I will argue this point with anybody, if Hu Jintao had changed the policy about Tibet and been friendly to Tibet and friendly to the Dalai Lama and used the Dalai Lama's influence over the Tibetans to create a harmonious relationship, as he always talks about, harmonious society, the Tibet problem would be over. It would be, everyone would be happy. And by now, Hu Jintao personally would have received Nobel Peace Prize. And he would have a Nobel Peace Prize without losing Tibet. So he would even be popular in China. And Dalai Lama would be teaching Buddhism to Chinese people in China. And they'd be very happy. Like the Kalmyks here in Russia, in the Kalmykia Republic, the Dalai Lama went there in 2004. They were very happy. And eventually, Russian government will give a visa to Dalai Lama to go back to Kalmykia soon, and they will be happy again. They haven't been doing for 8 years because they're scared of the leadership of China. Foolish, unnecessarily. If you stand up to them, they then respect you, actually. If you cave into them, they don't even respect you. So it's silly to cave into them. They're just bluffing like a poker player, you know. We're going to freak out if you don't do what we say. But they don't actually. They then do what they want to, because they want to do business. Above all, they want to do business, and they have a lot of business to do with Russia. And they're not going to give back on Russia. Okay, so therefore, I'm trying to say, clash of civilization you can refute and you can reject, and you don't have to take it seriously. Now I want to come to Russia in conclusion. And that is, clash of civilization is very negative toward Russia. And this leadership group that I'm talking about, which are all the world leaders actually, not almost absolutely all of them, who are trying to cling to this old militaristic idea of control everybody, you know, and dominate them and have a big army and a heavy police. These people, the clash of civilization, Russia, the Russian people are a bridge between East and West. You know, Mongolian element in Russia is very important in Russian history. And genetically, I think like 80% of the Russians have a little Mongolian, touch of Mongolian, actually, 80%. And there are some small still republics, and so now population-wise it's not so big, but it's not so small either. And therefore, and Russia has a huge border with China. And Russia has every reason to get along harmoniously with China and not make clash of civilization, and not allow Chinese to pretend there has to be clash with Russia, give them an excuse. You really don't want to do that. You have areas near China that we would be quite hard to defend man to man on the ground if China decided to get aggressive with you. It would not be nice for you. So therefore, Russia cannot have clash of civilization with China, and you don't want to, and nobody wants you to. We don't want to. Similarly, Russia has large Islamic minority, and I don't know the numbers, but I think it's quite large. All these former Soviet republics that are basically Islamic. You had terrible difficulties in Chechnya, for example, which I don't know if they're quite over. I don't think so. You had, you know, so you don't want to have a clash of civilization with Islam. So therefore, everyone who is a foreign diplomat in Russia should understand Islam very well, and when dealing with Islamic people should be able to know when they are giving you the Saudi version, which will not be friendly, and when you have another version like Sufism or other kinds of versions of Islam that are much more moderate and much more able to coexist in a pluralistic multinational society like the Russian Federation. And then final point I want to make, and this is a little bit shocking even to me, and you can disagree with me in the question period, but final point I want to make. I only realized this in full force recently, although I've thought this since 20 years, actually. But then, you know, you don't think about it. I haven't. Rinpoche invited me here many times, and I didn't make it. He was very mad with me for 4 or 5 years. I kept getting too busy, and I couldn't come. Because I actually really love Russia. I really admire Russia. And one of the reasons I admire Russia so much in the modern period is that Russia withdrew from its empire in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine and in Kazakhstan voluntarily, without any violence, without firing a shot. You've had the problem in Chechnya. You did have before that the problem in Afghanistan of your leadership trying impractical things. But basically you withdrew from huge. Henry Kissinger, who is the big Clash of Civilization guy, who is an employee of the Chinese government, by the way, not the American government. But Henry Kissinger was completely freaked out when the Russian people decided that life under militarism was too boring. No Apple computer, no Mickey Mouse, no food even in the store, no nice clothes. It's really bored with it. All the money spent on worrying about some American lunatics. And they are lunatics, I don't blame you, but what, they can't do anything. You know, they are hopeless anyway. So they got sick of it, and the government withdrew voluntarily from huge areas that they controlled. According to Kissinger, that's impossible. His whole theory of foreign relations and diplomacy is that major power never withdraw from their power, have to have power. You know, like stupid idiot with a dumb voice. You know? Big power. I know him, I've talked to him. We can't do this.
We would like to take questions. We have only time for 2 or 3.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, but I just need to finish.
I'm really sorry.
But let me just finish this last point. So therefore, since then, though, there's a rhetoric, because the rhetoric is by these leaders who depend on Clash of Civilization, who want people to stay into militarism, even though it's no longer practical in the 21st century. They don't want to have to do dialogue. They don't want to diminish the power of military worldwide. But you countries set an example in the middle of the world, largest territory in the world, and you withdrew voluntarily without violence. I don't see America withdrawing voluntarily from Puerto Rico or wherever, Hawaii or some places they have been. I don't see it. So you're a leader. China is not withdrawing from many places that they are really not China, that they own. So, but then you think maybe, a lot of Russians might think, oh, we lost. But the point is, you didn't lose. You led the way into the 21st century, is what I'm trying to say. And your example should be followed by America, should be followed. There is no superpower. That's a fake. The new civilization, the change of civilization is superpower, is you young people with your iPhones. That's a superpower. And among you young people, guys, I'm sorry, boys, among you young people, superpower are the women. Look at this class. More women. The women are the superpower. And the young people are the superpower, not any of these military governments. They are not the superpower. They're trying to keep everybody afraid, but actually you Russian people are the leaders in this respect and should be proud and not feel that you lost. You actually won. You won because you chose life and happiness and sensible gentleness over the old dominating violence business that's been going on for thousands of years. And you're following Tolstoy, the older Tolstoy. He was your person. It's okay. Now, question. I'm sorry. I talked too long. Thank you.